afternoon, good evening, and good night to everyone listening at whatever time you're listening. I am Joe Anthony Myrick, or Jam for short, because I do be jamming, and this is the Mental Health Check-In Podcast, a podcast that seeks to help you heal through mental health awareness. The more we learn, the more we heal. And today, we can heal through the words of Anthony Jeannot. Anthony Jeannot is a comedian with a decade's worth of stand-up experience, but he's also very well versed when it comes to anti-anxiety techniques. All thanks to some guidance from his therapist, by the way. He actually kicked some knowledge about all the techniques that he's learned in this really fantastic article that he wrote for the Tiny Buddha publication. I'll be sure to drop a link to that below, but the article is actually a big reason why I really wanted to get to know Anthony for this podcast episode. Usually every episode I want to have meaningful conversations about the knowledge and mental health advice that my guests may have. But with this, even given his profession of comedy, I really wanted to get to know the man behind the jokes, so to speak, or perhaps even beyond the jokes. And I wanted to get to know Anthony Jeannot for Anthony Jeannot. And I'm happy to say that the mission was accomplished, and we have very, very meaningful conversation, and I can't wait to transition to that right now. But first, as always, before I get to the conversation, I just want to let you know where you can find this person in case you wrap up the convo and want to say, hey, I want to see more of this guy now. I want to see more of this person and what they do. And like I said, what Anthony does is comedy. And he actually dropped his debut stand-up comedy special on Spotify. His first stand-up comedy album is actually, it's literally called Stand-Up Comedy Album, which is very appropriate. Very appropriate, if I do say so myself. You can also give him a follow on Instagram and Twitter at Anthony Jeannot. If you're listening, you can spell his last name as Jeannot. Anthony Jeannot, who also has a website, anthonyjeannot.com, and a podcast of his own called Highbrow Drivel, which you can also listen to on Spotify and an array of other podcasting platforms. It's available on all podcasting platforms, just like this podcast, the Mental Health Check-In Podcast, which you can listen to us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Anchor, Breaker, and anywhere else you get your podcasts, including UpliftUnited.com and their podcast network. And if you want further updates from us specifically, you'd have to follow us at Check-In Pod on Twitter or at Check-In Podcast on Instagram. And please, by all means, spread the word about this podcast. Tell your friends about this podcast. Even if spreading the word isn't necessarily sharing it in tweets and Instagram stories, but just texting a link to a buddy, specifically buddies who really need to hear this podcast because they're in the slumps right now. More than anything else, I just want this show to reach the people who it needs to reach, who it needs to heal. And if you're one of these people, I hope you get something out of this episode. And even more importantly, I hope you feel better and that you're taking care of yourself, that you're drinking water, you're eating, bathing, moisturizing, talking to someone, maybe seeing a therapist. But if none of that works for you, not this episode, not taking care of yourself, and you think you might be at risk for something worse, then please, by all means, refer to the description where I've linked some hotline numbers for you to use at your discretion. Now, with all of that said, let's just dive right into this. How you feeling emotionally, physically, spiritually, all that jazz?
Yeah, dude, it's weird. Like we were saying a bit before off air, I think Mondays are always, I think over the weekend you can kind of kid yourself into being like, oh, I'm just having a relaxed, chilled weekend, and like take it in isolation and forget the fact that this is the 800th chilled, relaxed weekend, and you never do that, But then Monday is kind of the first moment where every Monday since this whole thing started is a bit like, oh yeah, nah, I forgot this doesn't end yet. So
Yeah,
that's where I'm at mentally. I think I don't know about. Do you guys have Blue Monday in the US? Do you guys talk about that?
I've actually never heard of that. What's Blue Monday?
Blue Monday's a thing they talk about over here in the UK. I never heard about it until I moved, but apparently it's kind of um, the period because winter, the days get short, it gets cold, it gets a bit grim, but you've got Christmas from New Year's and the festive season usually, right? And then apparently Blue Monday is the furthest you get from Christmas before the days start getting longer and warmer. So apparently it's like emotionally the saddest time of the year to be around here because it's like, you're not the Christmas buzz is worn off and you're still ages away from spring.
That's actually a thing over here, but like we never like called it Blue Monday. We just say that people are sad during the winter.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. It's weird because here it has become like any other, like you put a name on a day, people want to sell shit, right? So here it's become like a big sales thing, like, oh, pick up your mood on Blue Monday, buy this box set of DVDs for the DVD player you don't own anymore. Like it's just weird,
I think the whole world kind of has a case of the Blue Mondays. Like, so like, what do you do when like you've got a case of the Blue Mondays every winter?
That's a good point. And so there's some really like nerdy, boring things that because I moved from Australia to the UK, and one of the first things my doctor said was like, you're not going to get enough vitamin D in winter. Period. So I like if I when I start to feel the winter mood blues kicking in, like there's some nerdy stuff I do, like making sure I'm taking my vitamin D and sitting in front of a sad lamp and all of the things that kind of trick your body into to getting some of the things that it missed. So that's kind of the nerdy stuff. And then in terms of like other stuff, I think like anything with me managing like my mental health is so much about habit, and it's so much about just like grounding myself and kind of turning all the noise off a bit, and so like anytime it's annoying that by the time I realize, oh, this is coming on, it's already like at the point where it gets harder to do this basic stuff you just need to do, and it helps. And like, why are you being such a douche about it? Like, this is the stuff that helps. But that is all of the, it's making sure you get active and keep your body moving a bit. It's making sure you're drinking enough water and making sure you're going to bed early and taking time to meditate and do things that kind of quiet everything down. And that's like if there's not any kind of external thing, that it's just like feeling a bit, which happens to all of us. And so that's kind of that's kind of the stuff I do if there's no external thing.
I definitely agree with you there. I think that's important. I agree with you with all the nerdy stuff, which I think it's funny you call it that because like half of that stuff I think it's just essential stuff, eating vitamins,
Yeah,
sleeping.
yeah, yeah. It is funny though, because wellness has become such a big industry, right? That everybody kind of wants to, oh, tell us about your Miracle 3000 system, and it's like, no, it's not that. It's like you go to bed early and you drink water.
And like it's funny when you think about it too, like getting in a routine can like help boost your mood a little bit, but at the same time, like you think that'd be the opposite, just because like with the pandemic going on, too much of the same thing every day, like you could get stir crazy about it. But I've learned that like getting in a routine while being stuck at home, be it locked down or just taking precaution during all this, if you stick to a routine, you feel accomplished. Does that make sense?
Yeah. 100%. There's two things about that I think are super interesting. One is that it's kind of like marking the days on the wall in prison, right? When you don't have external stimulus, you just need something to help tell you that time is moving. I got up, I ate my breakfast, whatever it is. And then secondly, at the start of the pandemic, which is something I do when I am really struggling, is a big point was to write lists of even just the most basic things that I did, because otherwise, as it kind of, again, like prison, it can get very easy to feel like, oh, time is passing and nothing is happening. Whereas if you write down, again, even if it starts off as breakfast, log on to work, send your work emails, blah, blah, blah. And you cross those things off, and then you get the dopamine and the endorphins because your body goes, you're doing stuff. And then all of a sudden it gets easier to add one more thing to that list and one more thing to that list. And then, you've got a bit more energy, even if it is just inside the space, because so much of it is like chemical, right? And so little things you can do to kind of trick your brain to give you the dopamine treat. It's like, dude, body, I'm not getting to go outside. I'm not, I'm not going to be out at a dance party. That dopamine you're making, it's got nothing else to do. So give it to me now.
I'm curious, like sticking on that, like how deep were you into the lockdown when you got to a point of, oh, I need to trick my brain for the dopamine, or I just need to get to routine to feel better? How far into the lockdown did you get into that point where, okay, I can make this work?
I think it was pretty early, man, because I moved to the UK largely to travel, right? And the first thing to disappear was that, And so all of a sudden, I was halfway around the world in a country that was much colder than I was. Australia, like, they're doing just fine. So, like, I'm in lockdown, my mates are at pubs in sunny weather. You know what I mean? Like, it was quite early that I was like, I'm going to need some coping mechanisms for this, because if you don't intervene early, this goes to a dark place.
What other like coping mechanisms have you learned in like lockdown? And like, was lockdown like the first place where you decide I need coping mechanisms, or were you putting in the mental health work prior to lockdown?
So it was something I actually really had to get on top of in my early 20s. When I first graduated uni, I quit my first 6 jobs in 5 months because I just had such bad anxiety and imposter syndrome. Every time I'd start a job, I'd be like, oh no, you're not good enough to do this job. Let's quit before they find out. And it wasn't until a friend was like, oh dude, that's not normal, that I spoke to a mental health professional and kind of got on top of it. So I've had sort of 10 years of talking to a therapist and reading blogs and like, what if I do this? And like kind of reporting back. So I was lucky enough. In fact, I kind of wrote a whole article about this, in that like when the pandemic hit, one of the weird things, besides having that moment of like, oh, I need to get on top of this early, was that as everybody else started to feel like panicky around me, I kind of felt like, oh, do you know what? This is kind of what my head's like at the best of times. It wasn't as surreal for me. So it was quite early that I recognized that I need to put the work in, and that's good. And that meant I need to do less work. But it was a blessing that I had a bunch of stuff that I'm like, okay, this is where you go. It was like being a doomsday prepper for your own mental mind, just like, boom, this is where we go. We've got our plan set out. We've done this before, done.
You did mention a good point about your article, which was a very good article, by the way. I may have to put a link in the description for that over at Tiny Buddha. And in that article, you talk a lot about anti-anxiety techniques. And for those who haven't read the article or just do have the leisurely time to read the article, can you summarize that a little bit? Like, what type of techniques work for you?
Yeah, exactly. So it's some of the stuff that I mentioned earlier about checking in, you're doing those basics, is kind of the starting point. And then some other things that, again, like, not everything will work for everyone, but these are the things that work for me. Journaling is super helpful, because I find occasionally there's stuff, because I'm a big meditator. That's the other one. Like, I'm a huge advocate for meditation. But one of the things, if you're in practice of that, is that because so much of that is about quieting down the noise, in some ways, some of the things that are popping up around in your subconscious, you get really good at ignoring, because you're kind of just letting them gently drift to the side. So I find journaling to be the other side of that, in that just like half hour, either before bed or when you wake up, and just write out whatever comes out. And sometimes you'll go like, oh, I didn't know that was a thing that I'm worried about. And sometimes for me, half the battle is knowing what's going on, what's causing these stuff. I think another one is like proactively reaching out to people and starting conversations, because when I'm feeling bad, I can tend to retreat, and that makes things worse. So I think proactively reaching out to people, and particularly people who may not expect to hear from you, because often, like, it's a really nice, again, it's a nice way to trick yourself to get that dopamine, because if you go, oh, I haven't heard from this person in ages, it would be nice to talk to them. Usually they're feeling the same way. So it's like it gives you a sense of newness and something interesting and something new into your routine. Another thing I mentioned was, again, those lists that we spoke about earlier. That's a huge one for me. What else? I think, again, because I love stand-up comedy, I think finding a way to laugh. And again, there's a bunch of science around the way that laughing tricks your body into feeling happier and stuff like that. And so whether it's watching comedy, or if you don't respond to that, making sure you talk to your funniest friend, or sometimes it can just be like sitting down like with my wife and being like, okay, let's just like be silly for a bit, like let's walk silly around the house. Particularly, you've got to be creative in these times. Like we've had days where it's like, you know what, we're at that point now. Let's walk silly around the house and not care that this is a ridiculous thing to do at any other time in life. This is how we're entertaining ourselves, and we're not going to judge ourselves for it, And I guess the key word to all of it is like also just giving yourself permission, like not denying the things that you feel, letting yourself feel them, acknowledging that, and then kind of figuring out what that means. And again, sometimes it means you're going to have a weekend where you're not productive, and that's okay. Sometimes it means that you're going to be a bit more ambitious. You're going to put an extra item on that list, and allow yourself to like try to do it and not judge yourself too much if it doesn't. It's so much of it is like the basic stuff you hear over and over again, and people get bored of it. But like the reason you hear it so much is because this is mostly what works, right?
Well, first off, to your point of, first off, I really like the idea of just trying to give yourself permission to enjoy the space, try to be at your most, entertain yourself, I suppose is the best way to summarize what you said. And to that point, I'm kind of curious of what do you do when all else fails? Like, let's say I'm super depressed and my hobbies aren't really hitting me like they used to, or the things that used to make me laugh hysterically don't make me laugh as much. Have you ever been to a point like that? And what do you do when you get to that point?
Yeah, I've been there, and it's rough. It is like, it's one of those things where, and again, to be fair, I'm glad you brought that up, because like, and I mean myself, and then there's a bunch of like people who actually make an industry out of this and wellness and stuff like that. And these are all things that can help. Like there's no undermining they can help, but you should never feel bad that this stuff doesn't work, because sometimes it's not gonna. And I think, again, the word permission comes right back. Like if you're in that space where you're trying to do the right stuff and the hobbies aren't hitting, and you just can't get there with any of them, I think that's where it gets super important to drill down to the absolute basics, which includes like, on the list, if you try, like write down, do something silly, try it. If it doesn't work, at least you cross that item off the list, you try again tomorrow. Like it is about giving yourself as much of it's starting to make it sound really academic, but it's about playing the percentages, you know what I mean? Giving yourself as much chance, doing as many of the right things in the hope that, hopefully one of these hit, whilst making sure you're careful enough. And it's a really fine balance, right? Because you don't want to be one of these people who are whipping themselves into feeling worse, because it's a really slippery slope to martyrdom, where you're just like, oh, I'm so sad and nobody wants to be around me. And like, you start to feel bad about how bad you're feeling, which is, again, it's a horrible place to be. And I don't want to make fun of it too much, but it's also like, it's like hard, it is one of those things where, as much as possible, you show up and you give yourself time, and you trust that, at least for me, I trust that I've done this before and I've been through the other side, and these were the things that got me there. I can't recommend highly enough that if you have the means and opportunities to talk to somebody professionally, that is a super impactful thing to do. Although I realize that's quite a privilege, a privilege that not everybody has, but I do think it's a super important thing for people to do if they can. And then to some extent, it's one of those things where usually when I've been in that position, by the time I get through the other side, I can't tell you what was the rope that I grabbed that got me there. I just, one slowly one day you feel a bit better, and then it incrementally improves. It kind of tends to be, for me at least, that it's a little bit forward and backwards, but once I start noticing that progress, even if it's one step forward, two steps back, three steps forward, it's still, I know, like, once it starts, it gets there a lot quicker than that period where it just feels like nothing's happening.
Yeah, I think you make an excellent point, excellent analogy, to be fair, too. Just the idea of grabbing a rope but not really knowing how you got hold of that rope. Because, like, I think about, like, when I was in a deep depression and I think about all the things I did, it was very much goes back to your points of just trying to latch on to something and hoping that it works. Like, I was doing phone calls with friends trying to get into my old hobbies, and then nothing was really working. Then X amount of months later, something just clicked like that. Like, I couldn't tell you what really snapped me out of it if there was a singular moment, but all of a sudden I just felt better. It was just kind of like for lack of better terms, kind of like trusting the process, I guess. And sometimes you gotta trust the process in yourself. Like, you just gotta keep going until it works, because eventually it might work. And if it doesn't, like you said, like sometimes you need stronger incentives like therapy or medications. And there's nothing wrong with that. And there's, if you do try to get back into your old hobbies, getting it back into things that make you happy, there's gonna be weeks where, hey, that's not hitting, I'm really not happy. But then there's going to be a week where, hey, it's working a little bit, and it may elevate slowly but surely every week until something finally just clicks.
Yeah. I think that's exactly my experience of it, man. Is that it's like it's really, I guess, again, to same analogy, it gets so dark down there that it's hard to figure out where the light came from, because once it starts coming, it kind of illuminates everything equally because it's so dark. And as you quite rightly said, it's cliche, but it's cliche for a reason. Like, all you can kind of do is trust the process and know that even if this doesn't make me feel better today, I will feel better quicker if I keep doing these things.
1000%. And back to the point of you being a stand-up comedian, and since you mentioned journaling, this is gonna sound unrelated, but I promise there's kind of a point I want to try to get to it. Like, with you being a stand-up comedian, has journaling helped your, I guess, your writing process and making your stand-up comedy by any chance?
Oh yeah, 100%. Especially because I think what I have done a lot of, and I've thought about this a lot more since I've not been on stage for the last year, sort of thing. But increasingly, what I've realized is that a lot of where my sense of humor developed was me finding a way to voice the things that I'm anxious about in a way that people would listen. If I had just always said, "Oh, I'm a bit worried about this, I'm a bit worried about that," as a kid, kids are brutal. They're not going to. So I guess what I did a lot of was hiding. It's kind of it's not a completely uncommon trope, but for me it was particularly anxieties that I was hiding with humor. And so a lot of my stand-up is just me processing things that make me nervous or anxious, and I kind of, on stage, I'm a bit of a bundle of nerves, kind of like and so journaling was super helpful, because once I figured out what was going on, what I was nervous about, it's so much easier to channel all those years of like defense mechanisms and verbal trickery that I've used to make jokes in social situations to allow me to talk about this stuff, because it's like, okay, this is what I used to do and this is what I want to talk about, and bang, all of a sudden there's a joke about how we can't afford houses. So yeah, journaling is a super helpful creative tool as much as it is a mental health tool for me.
I'm really glad you can use that as a coping mechanism. And it kind of takes me back to just like the days when I was like really shy and closed off when I was younger. Like, I never tried stand-up comedy, but to try to get over my bundle of nerves, my own anxiety, I would kind of I would kind of put on my own persona, really, like kind of like whenever I'd be in like a public space, it would basically be me, but times 10. I was just jumping bundle of joy. And a lot of people really like that. Like, a lot of people, I would get compliments, people saying I've actually written a really good talker, especially when talking to strangers. But like, I think that's really interesting. I'm not sure what that really speaks to of like kind of, I guess it kind of speaks to like a fake it till you make it mentality, you think?
Yeah. I also think particularly, and at this point I'm going completely, like I have to flag, I'm completely hypothesizing here. I've not seen any research. I'm not a mental health, but I do feel like anecdotally there are a bunch of people who are very good communicators, very good extroverts, not always comedians, but a lot of them are comedians as well, who are people who have anxiety because they've kind of got an overactive brain, and like the, overthinking things. I think being an empath as well probably correlates to having high anxiety. And if you're an overthinker and an empath, what you're likely to do is be aware that these nervous emotions you have make other people uncomfortable, and have the communication skills to kind of package them in another way, whether that be being an eloquent and like joyous public speaker, or somebody who tells jokes. But I think there is likely to be a correlation between, okay, you're thinking things too much, and also you read people well, so you're likely going to funnel those things into actually, kind of like you said, faking it till you're making it, giving people the version of you that they're going to respond to best, because that turns off the part of you that goes, oh, I wonder if they don't like me. Well, no, they're not going to not like me because I'm trying so fucking hard to make sure that they do, you know?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. Again, not professional in my own right, but I think you make a lot of good points. And like another thing that's really funny is that like I don't know about you, but in my case at least, like the more I would like pipe up this like persona to people, the more I kind of felt myself kind of like turning to that person in like a good way, and like or like melding into the person I really wanted to be, and that kind of like boosted my confidence to a point that I didn't really have to fake it anymore, you know?
Yeah, I think I agree with you, although I've had experiences in both directions, and I think it took me a long time to marry those two up. I think in my early 20s, I was probably a little bit too keen to go into that, hey, everybody likes me guy. And I'm actually made a bunch of friends who just weren't okay for me. Like we didn't vibe, but I'd figured out how to trick them, and none of them gave a shit that I wasn't this person, you know. And that can be super isolating and not really a great thing, because you know your friends and your social circle aren't people who actually get you, because you've tricked them into this, and to some extent it's unfair on them because they don't know you're tricking them, you know. But as I've grown up and made friends with the right people and stuff like that, what I think I've been able to do is, and I think also learning to do it on stage has helped. I think what I've been able to do is like strip away a lot of the facade of that trying to get people to like me, and actually do it in a much more authentic way that feels that is not going to attract people that wouldn't like me anyway. Like it's not apologetic. It's not hiding that I'm actually quite a nervous guy, or not hiding that I'm actually quite a sensitive guy, or any of these things that I was hiding in my 20s, but at the same time still gets the best out of the things that I did learn as a younger person, and still, I guess it means that people who are going to like me a lot quicker, and people who aren't, and either way I have to worry about them less.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's kind of like a double-edged sword in that regard. Like it's easy to like gravitate towards a lot of people and like bring in a whole lot of new friends, but at the same time, there's still the getting to know you type of stage. Like you still need to get through that person to get to know them. They need to get to know you, and the more they peel those layers back, or rather, the more you peel those layers back, you may see a person that you may not like, or vice versa, or just qualities you may not like, and then you just kind of have to use your judgment to like judge accordingly. Like, do I still want this person in my life? Are these qualities bad enough where they're more detrimental to my well-being than doing good to it. It's very it's something that you don't know till you know.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's something you don't get comfortable with until you get a bit older, or at least I didn't. But it can be a super liberating thing to just learn that, like, you know, there's 7 billion people out there, and most of them shouldn't be your best friends. You know, like most of them, we should all be kind and respectful for each other and not make things harder than they need to be, right? But beyond that, like, a lot of people just, you know, if you have to spend a lot of time with them, and you know, you're working with them or you're living with them or whatever, you can find a level, you can find a vibe that you guys can get on, and that can be fun, and that's really helpful to both or all of you, and that's cool. But like, not everybody in your life you come across needs to be somebody who loves you, because you don't love everybody. You know, you have people who you tolerate, you have people who are kind of cool, but they're not taking up your whole mental space. Similarly, you're going to be that for most people. And so the quicker, I guess, the moment I kind of started accepting that, it got a bit easier, you know, because I guess in somewhere in the overactive part of my brain, I was living a lot of my life thinking like, everybody needs to love me and I need to love everybody, and that's a lot of work. Like, that's exhausting.
Yeah, it's funny. Like it's like we dread like getting older, but like with age comes like that sort of hindsight and like your place in the world. Like it's okay to like drift off from people who don't really mesh well with you. It gets easier, as the cliche
Yeah,
goes.
yeah, definitely, definitely. Yeah, I think there is a lot to be said about the innocence of youth and why people love it. But I also think with a, like, you know, standard margin of error, most people are better when they get older.
Agreed, agreed. And to that point, well, first off, I just want to congratulate you on getting out. That's a big leap. And
Cheers, dude. I appreciate that.
yeah, and really, I think like putting out a body of work like that as just in any medium that you're really passionate about is a really big leap that I commend. Like whether it be a comedian putting out a comedy album, a musician putting out a stereo album, or someone with a really good voice having their first podcast, Exhibit A. But
Yeah, dude.
so like with that said, I kind of want to ask, like, before we get out of here, I just want to know if you have any advice for anyone who's eager to put out their own body of work, but they're kind of got their own like bundle of nerves going. So, like, with your experience, is there any advice you can give someone in that field, be it comedian, musician, future podcaster, anything like that?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just like put stuff out there constantly. I think that's one of the cool things about stand up and podcasting, and, you know, but other, like, Spotify exists now, blogging exists now. There are, you know, micro publishing sites where you can publish your book as you write it and get feedback. Like, I think the coolest thing about stand up is that you get live feedback the moment you think of something, right? I have an idea, I go on stage that night, I say it, the audience either laugh or they don't, and then I'm improving constantly. And I think maybe not exactly in the same way, but just get your work out there quickly, because you'll improve from feedback. And just because you put it out there doesn't mean it needs to be the final version of the thing. A lot of the jokes that are in my album I'd done on recorded sets at Melbourne Festival and this and that, and those things existed and they were out there, and the joke was improving, but it still got better, and it meant it made it to my album better. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, like, don't discount your thing that you're doing, right? There's a bunch of content, but there's enough people who consume content that there's always space for more. So, you know, don't waste a moment thinking like, oh, but who wants to listen to my thing? You know, if it's something that you genuinely believe in and that you genuinely love, there's going to be other people who do. So it's not about the thing having a space, it's about finding the space, you know, and you find the space quicker once you start putting stuff out there. So those two kind of go hand in hand. And then the third thing is, like, and again, it kind of all comes back to doing more of the stuff. Having something go not right is a lot easier when you've got a greater body of work where things have gone right. You know, if you release one song and it has 9 positive comments and 1 bad comment, then that's 10% of your comments that are bad. And that can feel like, oh shit, like 10%, like 1 in 10 people didn't like it. If you have hundreds of songs out there and then 90% are good, then all of a sudden you don't go 10% of people don't like me. You go like, oh, 900 people like me and 100 didn't. Like 900 people, that's a viable audience, you know? So the more you do, the more statistically insignificant negative feedback becomes, because it comes back to that thing we were talking about with not everybody has to like you earlier. You realize, like, because as a stand-up, I'm not under any illusions that I'm for everybody. You know, I'm not a slick wearing a suit and tie, and that's the reason I hate airplane food. It's like, it's a lot of what we've done today. It's a lot of nervous energy and like, and there are a bunch of people who I don't know if quite rightly is the word, but who may come to my gig and go, that's not at all what I think stand-up comedy is. And do you know what? Fine, fuck you. Find who you want to listen to. There are enough people who over the years make up an audience that I can do my version, and they don't want to see your guy. They want to see me. So we don't need to intersect. This isn't a, you know, debate. This is my thing can exist, your thing can exist, and we're all good.
I think that's all really good advice, and I hope someone takes away all of that from wherever they're listening from. And most importantly, thank you for coming on here. I really love this conversation. But before we get out of here, there is one thing I want to say. With every episode, I try to give people their flowers, so to speak, where I say why I appreciate you in case we never speak again for whatever reason. And
I hope we do, though. I've really enjoyed this chat, so I hope we stay in touch, dude.
hopefully, I'd love to, by the way. But if we don't, I just want you to know that I appreciate you for just being this unabashedly honest person. Like, from this conversation, especially, like, you're very honest and genuine to me. And even from your stand-up, I had the pleasure of listening to a little bit of your stand-up before this. I didn't have the time to listen to all of it because, like we were saying before we got on the air, bit of a case of the Mondays, busy Monday. But in what I heard, you were a very talented guy, very honest guy. And from this conversation, I can tell you're a very genuine guy whose heart is in the right place. And I hope that with that talent, all of your dreams come true and the cream rises to the top, as they say. And most importantly, I thank you for sharing your wisdom as far as someone who struggled with anxiety, someone who struggled with stage fright and all that. And I think your words, be it from the article, be it from your stand-up, be it from this conversation, is going to reach the right people who need it. And of course, I thank you for coming on this podcast.
Dude, I have had so much fun. I think the podcast you're doing and the theme is super valuable. And you know what? More valuable now than ever, right? So thanks so much for putting the time in and for being just such a great listener and a great person to have a chat with. I've had so much fun.